Chapter 35. It was here that we saw again the Grand Master of the king's household, in whose castle Joan was guest when she tarried at Chinon in those first days of her coming out of her own country. She made him bailiff of Troyes, now by the king's permission. And now we marched again. Chalons surrendered to us, and there by Chalons, in a talk, Joan being asked if she had no fears for the future, said yes. One treachery. Who could believe it? Who could dream it? And yet, in a sense, it was prophecy. Truly, man is a pitiful animal. We marched, kept on marching, and at last, on the 16th of July, we came in sight of our goal and saw the great cathedral towers of Rheims rise out of the distance. Huzzah after huzzah swept the army, from van to rear. And as for Joan of Arc, there where she sat, her horse gazing, clothed all in white armor, dreamy, beautiful, and in her face a deep, deep joy. A joy not of earth. Oh, she was not flesh, she was a spirit. Her sublime mission was closing in flawless triumph. Tomorrow, she could say, it is finished. Let me go free. We camped, and the hurry and rush and turmoil of the grand preparations began. The archbishop and a great deputation arrived, and after these came flock after flock, crowd after crowd of citizens and country folk, hurrahing in with banners and music, and flowed over the camp, one rejoicing inundation after another, everybody drunk with happiness. And all night long, Rheims was hard at work, hammering away, decorating the town, building triumphal arches, and clothing the ancient cathedral within and without in a glory of opulent splendor. We moved betimes in the morning. The coronation ceremonies would begin at 9 and last 5 hours. We were aware that the garrison of English and Burgundian soldiers had given up all thought of resisting the Maid, and that we should find the gates standing hospitably open and the whole city ready to welcome us with enthusiasm. It was a delicious morning, brilliant with sunshine, but cool and fresh and inspiring. The army was in great form and fine to see as it uncoiled from its lair fold by fold and stretched away on the final march of the peaceful coronation campaign. Joan, on her black horse, with the lieutenant general and the personal staff grouped about her, took post for a final review and a goodbye, for she was not expecting to ever be a soldier again, or ever serve with these or any other soldiers any more after this day. The army knew this, and believed it was looking for the last time upon the girlish face of its invincible little chief, its pet, its pride, its darling, whom it had ennobled in its private heart with nobilities of its own creation, calling her daughter of God, Savior of France, victory's sweetheart, the page of Christ. Together with still softer titles, which were simply naif and frank endearments, such as men are used to confer upon children whom they love. And so one saw a new thing now, a thing bred of the emotion that was present there on both sides. Always before, in march past, the battalions had gone swinging in a storm of cheers, heads up and eyes flashing, the drums rolling, the band braying paeans of victory. But now There was nothing of that. But for one impressive sound, one could have closed his eyes and imagined him in a world of the dead. That one sound was all that visited the ear in the summer stillness. Just that one sound, the muffled tread of the marching host. As the serried masses drifted by, the men put their right hands up to their temples, palms to the front, in military salute, turning their eyes upon Joan's face in mute "God bless you" and farewell, and keeping them there while they could. They still kept their hands up in reverent salute many steps after they had passed by. Every time Joan put her handkerchief to her eyes, you could see a little quiver of emotion crinkle along the faces of the files. The march past after a victory is a thing to drive the heart mad with jubilation, but this one was a thing to break it. We rode now to the king's lodging, which was the archbishop's country palace, and he was presently ready, and we galloped off and took position at the head of the army. By this time, the country people were arriving in multitudes from every direction and massing themselves on both sides of the road to get sight of Joan, just as had been done every day since our first day's march began. Our march now lay through the grassy plain, and those peasants made a dividing double border for the plain. They stretched right down through it, a broad belt of bright colors on each side of the road, for every peasant girl and woman in it had a white jacket on her body and a crimson skirt on the rest of her. Endless borders made of poppies and lilies stretching away in front of us. That is what it looked like. And that is the kind of lane we had been marching through all these days. Not a lane between multitudinous flowers standing upright on their stems. No, these flowers were always kneeling, these human flowers with their hands and faces lifted upwards to Joan of Arc, and the grateful tears streaming down. And all along, those closest to the road hugged her feet and kissed them and laid their wet cheeks fondly against them. I never, during all those days, saw any of either sex stand while she passed, nor any man keep his head covered. Afterward, in the great trial, these touching scenes were used as a weapon against her. She had been made an object of adoration by the people, and this was proof that she was a heretic, so claimed that unjust court. As we drew near the city, the curving long sweep of ramparts and towers was gay with fluttering flags and black with masses of people, and all the air was vibrant with the crash of artillery and gloomed with drifting clouds of smoke. We entered the gates in state and moved in procession through the city with all the guilds and industries and holiday costume marching in our rear with their banners. And all the route was hedged with a huzzaing crush of people, and all the windows were full, and all the roofs, and from the balconies hung costly stuffs of rich colors, and the waving of handkerchiefs, seen in perspective through a long vista, was like a snowstorm. Joan's name had been introduced into the prayers of the church, an honor theretofore restricted to royalty. But she had a dearer honor, and an honor more to be proud of from a humbler source. The common people had leaden medals struck which bore her effigy and her escutcheon, and these they wore as charms. One saw them everywhere. From the Archbishop's palace, where we halted, and where the king and Joan were to lodge, the king sent to the abbey church of Saint Remy, which was over towards the gate, by which we had entered the city, for the Saint Ampoule, or flask of holy oil. This oil was not earthly oil. It was made in heaven, the flask also. The flask with the oil in it was brought down from heaven by a dove. It was sent down to Saint Remy just as he was going to baptize King Clovis, who had become a Christian. I know this to be true. I had known it long before, for Pierre told me in Domremy. I cannot tell you how strange and awful it made me feel when I saw the flask, and knew I was looking with my own eyes upon a thing which had actually been in heaven, a thing which had been seen by angels, perhaps, and by God himself of a certainty, for he sent it. And I was looking upon it, I. At one time I could have touched it, but I was afraid, for I could not know but that God had touched it. It is most probable that he had. From this flask Clovis had been anointed, and from it all the kings of France had been anointed since. Yes, ever since the time of Clovis, and that was 900 years. And so, as I have said, that flask of holy oil was sent for while we waited. A coronation without that would not have been a coronation at all, in my belief. Now, in order to get the flask, a most ancient ceremonial had to be gone through with, otherwise the Abbey of Saint Remy, hereditary guardian in perpetuity of the oil, would not deliver it. So, in accordance with custom, the king disputed 5 great nobles to ride in column state and richly armed and accoutred, they and their steeds, to the abbey church as a guard of honor to the Archbishop of Reims and his canons, who were to bear the king's demand for the oil. When the 5 great lords were ready to start, they knelt in a row and put up their mailed hands before their faces, palm joined to palm, and swore upon their lives to conduct the sacred vessel safely, and safely restored again to the church of Remy after the anointing of the king. The archbishop and his subordinates, thus nobly escorted, took their way to Saint Remy. The archbishop was in grand costume, with his mitre on his head and his cross in his hand. At the door of Saint Remy they halted and formed to receive the holy vial. Soon one heard the deep tones of the organ and the chanting men. Then one saw a long file of lights approaching through the dim church. And so came the abbot in his sacerdotal panoply, bearing the vial, with his people following after. He delivered it with solemn ceremonies to the archbishop. Then the march back began, and it was most impressive, for it moved the whole way between 2 multitudes of men and women who lay flat upon their faces and prayed in dumb silence and in dread while that awful thing went by that had been in heaven. This august company arrived at the great west door of the cathedral, and as the archbishop entered, a noble anthem rose and filled the vast building. The cathedral was packed with people in thousands. Only a wide space down the center had been kept free. Down the space walked the archbishop and his canons, and after them followed those 5 stately figures. In silence, in splendid harness, each bearing his feudal banner and riding. Oh, that was a magnificent thing to see. Riding down the cavernous vastness of the building, through the rich lights streaming in long rays from the pictured windows. Oh, there was never anything so grand. They rode clear to the choir, as much as 400 feet from the door, it was said. Then the archbishop dismissed them, and they made deep obeisance till their plumes touched their noses, necks, and their horses' necks, then made those proud prancings and mincings and dancing creatures go backward all the way to the door, which was pretty to see, and graceful. Then they stood them on their hind feet and spun them around and plunged them away and disappeared. For some minutes there was a deep hush, a waiting pause, a silence so profound that it was as if all those packed thousands there were steeped in dreamless slumber. Why, you could even notice the faintest sounds, like the drowsy buzzing of insects. Then came a mighty flood of rich strains from our 400 silver trumpets, and then, framed in the pointed archway of the great west door, appeared Joan and the king. They advanced slowly, side by side, through a tempest of welcome, explosion after explosion of cheers and cries mingled with the deep thunders of the organ and rolling tides of triumphant song from chanting choirs. Behind Joan and the king came the paladin with the banner displayed, and a majestic figure he was, and most proud and lofty in his bearing, for he knew that the people were marking him and taking note of his gorgeous state dress, which covered his frame. At his side was the Sire Albrecht, proxy for the Constable of France, bearing the sword of state. After these, in order of rank, came a body royally attired representing the lay peers of France. It consisted of 3 princes of the blood, and La Trumille and the young de Laval brothers. These were followed by the representatives of the ecclesiastical peers of the Archbishop of Reims and the Bishop of Léon, Chalon, Orleans, and one other. Behind these came the grand staff, all our great generals and famous names, and everybody was eager to get a sight of them. Through all the din one could hear shouts all along that told you where 2 of them were. "Live the bastard of Orleans! Satan higher forever!" The august procession reached its appointed place in time, and the solemnities of the coronation began. They were long and imposing, with prayers and anthems and sermons, and everything that is right for occasions, and Joan was at the king's side, all these hours with her standard in her hand. But at last came the grand act. The king took the oath. He was anointed with the sacred oil, a splendid personage, followed by train bearers and other attendants, approached, bearing the crown of France upon a cushion, and kneeling offered it. The king seemed to hesitate, in fact, did hesitate for the put did hesitate, for he put out his hand and then stopped it there in the air over the crown, the fingers in the attitude of taking hold of it. But that was for only a moment, though a moment is notable. Something when it stops the heartbeat of 20,000 people and makes them catch their breath. Yes, only a moment. Then he caught Joan's eye, and she gave him a look with all the joy of her thankful great soul in it. Then she smiled and took the crown of France in his hand, and right finely and right royally lifted it up and set it upon his head. Then what a crash was there! All about us, cries and cheers, and the chanting of the choirs, and the groaning of the organ, and outside the clamoring of the bells and the booming of the cannon. The fantastic dream, the incredible dream, the impossible dream of the peasant girl who stood fulfilled. The English power was broken. The heir of France was crowned. She was like one transfigured. So divine was the joy that shone in her face as she sank to her knees at the king's feet and looked up at him. Through her tears, her lips were quivering, and her words came soft and low and broken. Now, O gentle king, is the pleasure of God accomplished according to his command, that you should come to Rheims and receive the crown that belongeth of right to you and unto none other. My work which was given me to do is finished. Give me your peace, and let me go back to my mother, who is poor and old, and has raised me and need of me. The king raised her up, and there before all that host he praised her great deeds in the most noble terms. And there he confirmed her nobility and titles, making her the equal of a count in rank, and also appointed a household and officers for according to her dignity. You have saved the crown. Speak, require, demand, and whatever grace you ask it shall be granted, though it may make the kingdom poor to meet it. Now that was fine. That was royal. Joan was on her knees again straightway and said, Then, O gentle king, if out of your compassion will you speak the word, I pray you give commandment that my village, poor and hard pressed by reason of the war, may have its taxes remitted. It is so commanded. Say on. That is all. All? Nothing but that? It is all. I have no other desire. But that is nothing, less than nothing. Ask. Do not be afraid. Indeed, I cannot, gentle king. Do not press me. I will not have aught else, but only this alone. The king seemed nonplussed and stood still a moment, as if trying to comprehend and realize the full stature of this strange unselfishness. Then he raised his head and said, She has won a kingdom and crowned its king. And all she asks and all she will take is this poor grace. And even this is for others, not for herself. And it is well, her act being proportioned to the dignity of one who carries her head and heart riches which outvalue any that any king could add, through though he gave his all. She shall have her way. Now, therefore, it is decreed that from this day forth Domremy, natal village of Joan of Arc, deliverer of France, called the Maid of Orleans, is free from all taxation forever. Whereat the silver horns blew a jubilant blast. There, you see, she'd had a vision of this very scene the time when she was in a trance in the pastures of Domremy, and we asked her to name the boon she would demand of the king if she should ever chance to tell her she might claim one. But whenever she had the vision or not, this act showed that after all the dizzy grandeurs that had come upon her, she was still the same simple, unselfish creature that she was that day. Charles III remitted those taxes forever. Often the gratitude of kings and nations fades, and their promises are forgotten or deliberately violated. But you, who are children of France, should remember with pride that France has kept this one faithfully. 63 years have gone by since that day. The taxes of the region wherein Domremy lies have been collected 63 times since then, and all the villages of that region have paid except that one, Domremy. The tax gatherer never visits Domremy. Domremy has long ago forgotten what that dread sorrow-sowing apparition is like. 63 tax books have been filled, meantime, and they lie yonder with the other public records, and any may see them that desire it. At the top of every page in the 63 books stands the name of a village, and below that name is a very weary burden of taxation is figured out and displayed. In the case of all you save one, it is true, just as I tell you. In each of the 63 books, there is a page headed Dom Remy. But under that name, not a figure appears. Where the figures should be, there are 3 words written at the same words have been written every year for all these years. Yes, it is a blank page with always those grateful words lettered across the face of it, a touching memorial. Domremy, rien la pucelle. Nothing? The Maid of Orleans. How brief it is, yet how much it says. It is the nation speaking. You have the spectacle of that unsentimental thing, a government making reverence to that name and saying to its urgent Cove and pass on, it is France that commands. Yes, the promise had been kept. It will be kept always. Forever was the king's word. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the ceremonies of the coronation came at last to an end, Then the procession formed once more, with Joan at the king of its head, and took up its solemn march through the midst of the church, all instruments and all people making such clamour of rejoicing noises, as was indeed a marvel to hear. And so ended the third of the great days of Joan of Arc's life. And how close together they stand. May 8th, June 18th, and July 17th.